Thank you all so much for taking your time this afternoon, Tuesday afternoon, to be with us. This is the National African American Child and Family Research Center's Research Capacity Building webinars. I am the director of the National African American Child and Family Research Center, Latrice Rollins, and I am so honored that you all decided to spend your time with us today. I want to just give a short plug for our annual conference that is coming up. This is a free hybrid conference. So if you don't want to come to Atlanta, I don't know why anybody wouldn't want to come to Atlanta, but you can also join us online. This is our community engaged research conference where we will be sharing research in the spaces of TANF, poverty alleviation, early care and education, really focusing in on research that is done in partnership with parents and also research that will help to advance policies that will help particularly African-American families. And so please join us. The QR code is there for you all to get the link to the website and register to be with us. So just a few reminders about this particular webinar and how we will kind of have the format today. So we are recording now, and we do ask that you use the chat if you have any comments or suggestions or any resources that you want to share with the group. You're open and welcome to do that. You also are able to use the Q&A box to ask any questions throughout the conversations or throughout the sessions. You will be able to get your questions answered at the end. If we do see some things that we can answer offline just through the Q&A box, we will do that. We do ask you just to be present and participate. This time is going to go by really fast. So just take some time to be present in this space and be active in the chat or ask your questions so that you can get the most out of this session. All right, so we're going to get started. This is our webinar focusing on equity and inclusion language for community engagement. And so I'm going to stop sharing so that our first speaker can queue up her slides and I can read her bio. And so we're going to hear first from Natalie Burke. She is a nationally known speaker, strategist, and public health leader. She is the president and CEO of Common Health Action, whose mission is to develop people and organizations to produce health through equitable policies, programs, and practices. In addition to serving as the primary architect of Common Health Action's Foundations of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion online course and certification, for 7 years, Natalie served as my co-director, my director of the Robert Wood Johnson funded Culture of Health Leaders program. I'm one of the Culture of Health Leaders, so honored to have her here. But she believes that to alter our collective health destiny, we must change our language. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about challenging deeply held beliefs about equity and identity in our society. She also believes in creating systems that work for all people and accept the role we each play in the production of the public's health. So Natalie, take it away.
Thanks so much, Latrice. I'm happy to be here with you all today. And I'm hoping that we can have some good conversation and also that to some degree that we can open up some new ideas that you all will be able to take along with you. So I have to tell you as a side note, it's rare that you get two Natalies in one conversation. So I'm also looking forward to hearing what Natalie Williams has to say later on. So today I want to talk to you about exploring the impact of language on people and communities, exploring some specific words and terms, as well as some potential alternatives, and identifying ways to communicate with communities to build trust and authentic relationships. So my hope is to give you some things to think about. And I think it's important to note that it's okay to leave this conversation stewing. And while I may give you ideas, we may give you ideas, they are ideas. They're not carved in stone. And, I often joke and say, you can't go to Italy, tell a joke in Greek and expect for people to laugh. So it's really important for you to remember that as you are thinking about language, your audience is critically important to how you take what we give you today and apply it to real world. The other thing I'm hoping, of course, is that we give you some things to talk about. So I believe that language is a consistently moving thing. And I think it's important that we have conversations and discussions within our organizations about what is the language we're using and what's the impact of that language. Part of what that also means is recognizing that we often go into working relationships with one another without agreements about the language that we are using. So often when I go into, whether it's community-based collaboratives or organizations or institutions of any kind, one of the first things that I'll ask them is, do you have a glossary? Do you have something that is your guiding document, your agreements about what words actually mean? So I want to encourage you on the front end to think about, if you don't have a glossary of terms that applies to your work, what would it take to develop that in a way that is equitable and inclusive so that the language could be meaningful to you and to everyone else who's involved in the work? So in addition to giving you some things to think about and some things to talk about, my hope is also to make you a little bit uncomfortable. So my invitation is for you to get uncomfortable. And the reason is this: I believe that before any great change, every change is preceded by some level of discomfort. If you're anything like me, you probably every now and then take a break from the gym, and you'll find that when you decide to make your way back, it is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable when you arrive and you look around and you feel that maybe people are throwing a little shade because they haven't seen you in a while. It's uncomfortable because maybe they've moved equipment. And it's uncomfortable because your body is actually uncomfortable in the space. So if I raise language that is meaningful to you and you find your shoulders creeping up your ears because you are uncomfortable by what I'm saying, I'm going to ask you to drop your shoulders and remain open-minded. In that, I believe that part of my role here is to try to orchestrate constructive discomfort. The goal is that in this quest to change the language that we use, that you are uncomfortable, but not to the point of shutting down, right? So to be uncomfortable is not the same thing as to be unsafe. So I just encourage you, stand in the discomfort and recognize that this is an opportunity for growth. So where's my mind today? It's interesting. I usually at the beginning of a talk frame where I am in my head. And, there are a couple of things that are on my mind. One is that we are truly a deeply divided America. I look at the news in Maryland, where I am today. We're getting ready to go and vote. And so, of course, we are being besieged with flyers and with signs and with ads and so on and so forth. And I think while many of that is well intended to draw the attention for particular candidates, I also think that it in some ways can reinforce deep divisions that already exist, that are not helpful to creating the type of equity that we hope to see in society and that we hope to see in health. So I think I'm stewing on the divisiveness and how that connects to the electoral process and even my civic responsibility. In that, it's a recognition that these are high stakes elections because they connect to something that's really important, and that's power. And so this is one of the first words that I want to make sure that I define. In doing community work, in doing organizational work, systems change work, power is a critical component. So this is the simplest way that I can explain to you what power is. Power is the ability to define reality for yourself and for others. The ability to define reality for yourself and for others. If you think about, let's say, an elected official, by making policy, they have the opportunity to define reality, right? If you think about leaders within organizations, ability to define reality. If you think about community-based change efforts, grassroots efforts, there's power in that because there is the ability to define reality. Those people are looking to define reality for themselves and for others in their community. So I want you to keep it front of mind. What is power? It defines reality. So next, I want to talk to you about some of the language that I think is really important. You've heard me say the word equity a number of times, but before I even get into that in any real detail, I want to talk to you a little bit about the difference between disparity and inequity. And for folks who know me, this is one of the thorns in my side of language. A disparity and an inequity are not the same thing. A disparity is merely a difference in status or outcome between groups of people, right? So let's say you were saying a health disparity. It is a difference in status or outcome in health between groups of people. Now, in and of itself, it is not a negative thing not all differences are negative. When it can become a negative thing is when a disparity is actually an inequity. An inequity is a particular type of disparity. These are disparities that are systemic, preventable, avoidable, and unjust. And they are the result of policies and practices that create barriers to opportunity, whether those are barriers to opportunity for health or for education or for housing. And so why I think this is so important to differentiate between a disparity and an inequity is that if you were to think of the example of breast cancer, if you were to look at rates of breast cancer with regard to females and males, you will find that females have higher rates of breast cancer. That is a biological predisposition. And to some degree, that is what it is. But if you were to look at breast cancer survival rates by race for females, you will find that there are significant differences based on racial identity. And when you look into the science with regard to that, you will find that many of those differences in outcome, especially when it comes to survival, could be changed. They are preventable, avoidable, and unjust. And if we changed policies and practices, we would find that particularly Black women would have greater opportunities to survive breast cancer because they would be diagnosed earlier, they would have access to care, they would have transportation to get there, there would be social supports, they would have insurance to cover whatever the care is that they need. So again, there's a difference between a disparity and an inequity. And the other piece that I'll say is this: if the goal in our work is around equity, wouldn't the opposite of equity be inequity? So here's the challenge with regard to disparity and inequity. We've codified, we've put it and made it solid and to some degree immovable because it's how we talk about inequities in public policy. We're saying disparities, but what we mean is inequities, right? And so what I will say is that over the years, a number of organizations and institutions have started the process of beginning to evolve the language. So this is going to be evolution rather than revolution, and it's going to take time. But I believe that that change is happening. I'm starting to see it in different documents and in the way that people are speaking. So next, in addition to disparity and inequity, I want to make sure that I clarify that there is a difference between equality and equity. Now, often they are used interchangeably, and it's actually a little bit confusing. So I want to try to break this down and make it simpler for you. So one example that I use is a running example. So whether you ran track or whether you, like me, you watch people run on TV, you probably learned over time that if people are running a 100-meter or 100-yard dash, they line up shoulder to shoulder. And on any given day on that even line, they all have an equal opportunity to win the race because based on their natural ability, training, and effort, being lined up shoulder to shoulder in a straight run is a fair way to approach that. That's equality. Equity is different. Imagine that people are running a 400-meter race. And so when they line up in that way, they stagger to start. Why do they stagger the start? Because we want to make sure that everyone has a fair opportunity to win the race. If they lined up shoulder to shoulder, the person who was on the inside would actually have an unfair advantage and have a shorter distance to run, hence the term the inside track. And so this is an easy way to explain the difference between equity and equality. In the equity example, it requires us to make an adjustment to where we align people so that they will have a fair opportunity to have their best possible outcome. So here's another example. This is a little bit older now, but this is an example that comes from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. You'll see here, everyone at the top has the same bicycle. It's an equal approach. But at the bottom, each person has a bicycle that meets their needs, right? And that's the difference between equality and equity. Equality is about sameness, and equity is about whatever is necessary to get to that best possible outcome. Here's another more recent example that comes from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation of equality and equity. And when you look at the curve in the first example around equality, you can see that it was designed and it was built, the structure was built in a way that did not accommodate the needs of everyone. It doesn't allow for full access or participation. And in fact, the way that it's structured equally can actually be unsafe for some people. For instance, the person who is in a wheelchair, the person who's using a walking stick or may have a vision impairment. And so to the right, you can see that the equitable approach is that everyone has what they need. The interesting part is this: if you think about equality and equity, the cost, in a sense, to design this corner in one way or the other could be very, very similar. So the idea is that if we can ask the question about what is the equity impact as we are designing, we then have a better chance of creating conditions and circumstances for people where they can get to their best possible outcome. So when I talk about equity, equity requires us to provide all people with fair opportunities to achieve their full potential. So when I put this definition up, people usually get stuck on one particular word, and that word is fair. And people will say, well, what's fair? You can't tell me what fair is. It's subjective, it's a matter of opinion, and it cannot be measured. So the way that I respond to that, and when you talk about fairness, what I would encourage you to do is to potentially frame it like this. Fair is not what you think it is or what I think it is. Fair is whatever is necessary within the confines of the law and resources to get a person, a family, a community, or a population to the best possible outcome. That's what's actually fair. That is something that you can measure. It is not subjective, and it's not a matter of opinion. If you were to think about when COVID happened, they showed a lot of aerial views of people in their cars going to get food assistance. If the approach that's taken is that every car load of people gets a box of food that's identical, again, that is an equal approach, but it's not fair because it's not what's going to get that particular carload of people to the best possible outcome if it is not enough food, right? And so fair is whatever is necessary to get a person, a family, a community, or a population to the best possible outcome. It can be measured. It is not a matter of opinion, all right? So here's the thing. Words actually have power. This is not just about being particular. They, again, have power because remember, power is the ability to define reality for yourself and for others. Language, the words that we use, actually creates perceptions and defines reality for people. And that's why the words that we use are so important, particularly when we're working in communities. Another reason why language is so important is that the epigeneticists say that language has the ability over time to change the way that our genes express themselves. So language that is oppressive, language that is derogatory, language that is hurtful and harmful actually has the potential at a cellular level to begin to make us sick. Robin Williams says it, no matter what people tell you, words and ideas can change the world. And I think we can see this more recently, the past 5 to 10 years, particularly with the misinformation on various social media platforms and the disinformation that's intentionally circulated to change the way that people perceive the world and what people choose to believe is true. So with that, I want to begin to explore some specific language. I want to start with the word vulnerable. So vulnerable, when you think about it in this way, and I just realized that this is showing up in a slightly different way, so bear with me, you all. All right, there we go. So the animations can show. Vulnerable is not what you think it is or what I think it is. Vulnerable is a really important thing with regard to community. And bear with me 1 second. I want to make sure that I make this viewable, the full screen.
It's showing fine. Oh,
there we go.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure it's pulling this out. Thanks for your patience. Okay, so often when we go into communities, we will refer to people as vulnerable or populations as vulnerable. I was in Mississippi years ago at a Saturday community meeting, and I had a 12-year-old girl stand up and ask me, why did people continue to come into their community and call them weak? I said, weak? Who called you weak? She said, you did. I said, when did I say that? She said, you called us vulnerable. It is so important that we recognize that the language that we use when working in and with community members is language that they internalize and then begin to attribute to themselves and also that they will mirror that language outward. So for instance, if a community-based coalition is applying to get a grant, they will model the language that they see in that RFP. The word vulnerable, time and time again, and working with veterans, they've told me they don't want to be called vulnerable. And so it's important for us to make note of that. What's the alternative? Instead of labeling an individual or a group of people as vulnerable or population as vulnerable, why not opt to say that they are not vulnerable, but rather they experience vulnerability? You can experience medical, physical, social, economic vulnerability. You are having an experience of vulnerability, but you, the person or the population, are not actually vulnerable, right? So you can redirect the language. Next is empower. I'm sorry if it's in your mission statement, your vision statement, if it's in some goal somewhere, but when we repeatedly tell communities that we are empowering them, what it means then is that we create a perception that we are giving power to them when in fact they already have the power. The job that we have when working in communities ideally is to help them identify, harness, and use power, but we don't actually give the power to them. And so you can see what the dynamic is there and how top down it can be when we say we empower communities to do X, Y, and Z. So I want us to be very conscious about that. Next is language underserved. Now here's the thing, underserved has a technical definition, but what we've done over time is to make underserved into an umbrella term that we use repeatedly with communities. And the problem becomes this. If we are constantly talking about everything as being about underserved, it gives the impression that services will solve the problems and the inequities that we see in communities. Now, you and I, we all know services are not the sole answer to what's necessary for communities and populations to experience equity. So I want to encourage you to use underserved when you are specifically speaking about services. But when you're talking about the larger conditions, talk about a community as being under-resourced. And within the umbrella of a community being under-resourced, they may be underserved, but they may also be lacking leadership, capital, things within the natural environment, things within the built environment. There are many, many other challenges that a community can face that are not actually about services. Next, the term non-white. This is problematic. It's in academic literature. You will hear pundits and really smart people say it. The reality is that when you refer to people as non-white, you are centering whiteness. You are creating a culture of other. So what you're saying is white becomes the basis for everything else, and everything else is some sort of a variation or derivative on whiteness. I want to encourage you to call people what they are as opposed to referring to what they are not. Another reason why this is really important is if you do some research online, you'll find that non-white is the preferred language of white supremacists. So I would encourage you to either say people of color, or some people choose to say the words BIPOC, and BIPOC being Black, Indigenous people of color. Next, I want to talk to you a little bit about BIPOC. I have a perspective on this. I have talked to a lot of people about this over time. There is a historical context for the term people of color. It emerged as an umbrella term in an attempt to bring people together to have political power and to have a larger voice in the United States at a time when they did not have that voice. It created a coalition type mentality. BIPOC and its origins are complicated. And so it is not a term that I choose to use. I would encourage you, if you choose to use it, that you do research to find out from where it came and what the intent was behind it, so that you are using it in a way that is very intentional. It lifts out Black and Indigenous experiences and holds together other people of color. I can tell you, I have spoken to people who have the identities that would fall in the POC. They are very uncomfortable and are feeling left behind by the term BIPOC. And I will also tell you that I have spoken to many of my Indigenous brothers and sisters who don't particularly think that this is the best approach. So I don't think that there's one standard for this. And let me be really clear. You may choose to use the language. I would just encourage you to go and seek out the history of people of color, where and how it came from, and BIPOC, where and how it came from, and then make your own decision about the language that's best for you to use. Next is Latinx. there was a study that came out of Pew Charitable Trust a couple of years ago. And what it talked about was Latinx had emerged as a term from white academics who were seeking to take gender out of language of Spanish origin. And so in that, the term Latinx emerged and many people stepped forward to use it. The issue was that at that time, only 25 to 30% of people who would be identified as Latinx had even heard the term. And then everybody sort of jumped in and said, oh, we're going to start to refer to people as Latinx. In an impromptu way, I've had to host conversations in rooms of 300 people about this term and had people who fell on both sides of the issue, but the majority of people saying an individual should be able to decide what they are called. And if as an individual, they would like to be referred to as Latinx or they refer to themselves as Latinx, that's fine. But as a whole culture, a decision has not been made yet to say, this is who we are and this is how we define ourselves. So I think it's important for us to recognize, I think it is still being debated and litigated. And so I don't know that Latinx is there yet. Whatever there means, I don't know that it's there yet. And as a side note, what I will tend to do, and it depends on the audience, I may say Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latine. There are all of the terms and I may actually use all of them so that people have comfort and can find themselves in it. The next is the difference between minority and minoritized. Minority is about something that is quantifiable and numerical, but people can have a minoritized experience and be a majority. An example would certainly be if you were to look at South Africa before apartheid ended, you had in essence a Black majority that was having a minoritized experience. Often with women, you will find that they may be a numerical majority, but they are, because of power dynamics, experiencing and having a minoritized experience. And so minoritized is a different way to express the lived experiences of people who may experience oppression in some way, shape, or form. And so I think it's important because the other reason is that children often respond to the language minority in a way that it makes them feel smaller or less than. But to say that minoritized is about the experience you're having, again, is not all about labeling the person or the people, it's about labeling the experience. Next, we have ism. And so ism is important because when we talk about racism, classism, sexism, it is not about the individual interactions that we have, but it is more about the larger scale oppression that people may experience through systems and institutions. And so I would encourage you to think about the difference between when racism is at play as a system versus when people engage in racist behavior as individual actors, okay? Ism speaks to the larger system of belief and implementation of those beliefs. Next is the community. Often we speak about the community in a way that actually creates an us and them mentality. It's as though you are speaking about those people who are out there. What I will tell people is this: if you are working in a community and you cannot comfortably stand in front of a room full of the members of that particular place and say, our community, you have work to do. So it's not to say that using the term the community is a bad thing, but there is a context to that, that if you are a part of an institution and you are referring to the community, it can become problematic. So next, it's important to figure out what it means to be an authentic relationship and build trust. And so as a part of that, the language that we use is really important because it speaks to the degree to which we are committed to being inclusive and sharing power in various situations and circumstances. I wanted to lift up one resource for you. AAMC, the American Academy of Medical Colleges and Universities, worked on principles of trustworthiness. And so I would encourage you to go and take a look. I personally enjoy it because of the way it's written. And I think if you can share this in a community context, it's a great tone setter. And the language here says a lot. If you see the first one, it says the community is already educated. That's why it doesn't trust you. And so I think that there's a lot in here, but in framing about trustworthiness, Language is really, really important. If you are using language that is not intended to engage people meaningfully, you are boxing them out and you cannot be in a healthy and trustworthy relationship. Last few things, we often judge ourselves by our intentions, but we judge others by their impact. Many of us who are in helping professions have been fighting the same fight for a long time. And so what I'm asking people to do is really consider, what does impact look like regardless of intent? And how do we then hold ourselves accountable, and look at those measures of impact in new and different ways? Because I do believe that sometimes we can get lost in our intentions. And the last thing, and I just, this is a mural from Detroit, and it says, "They tried to bury us, they didn't know we were seeds." The language that we use, the way that we engage with each other, we are seeds. And so we have an opportunity to have those things to grow into something different. If we can change the language that we use with intent, we can have a different impact. That's it. I'm done. If you want to contact me, there's the information. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Natalie. And you all, there's a couple of questions for you, Natalie, in the Q&A. If you want to type them in, you can to respond, or we can do them at the end if they require a verbal response. But thank you for that information. We are going to move to Mr. Dia Harris. As he is pulling up his slides, I will do this introduction. So Dia Harris is the Administration for Children and Families, or ACF's newly appointed Chief Equity Officer. He is nationally recognized as a thought leader, strategist, and advisor. At ACF, he directs the implementation of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility initiatives, or DEIA. He assists in the establishment of DEIA goals and execute agency-wide action plans. He provides leadership and strategic direction in recruiting and sustaining a diverse workforce and environment to ensure that all employees are supported in contributing to the mission, vision, and strategies of the organization. So take it away, Dia. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for that, Latrice. And thank you and hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Dia Harris. I am the Chief Equity Officer at the Administration for Children and Families, which is an operating division under Health and Human Services. I want to talk about a few things today. I want to focus my presentation on kind of equity and inclusive language for community engagement, but focusing on the Head Start perspective, which I think is very important, and particularly with Head Start being housed under the Administration of Children and Families. So first thing I want to talk about workforce or workplace, kind of, with workforce, encouraging the recruitment of and creating inclusive space in the workplace for African-American men, women, and people in various program roles. Why is that important to us? A couple different things I've come to a conclusion to really realize that, one, diversity of perspectives is really important. Having a diverse workforce brings together individuals with different backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives. This diversity fosters creativity and innovation, leading to better problem solving and decision-making within the organization is the first one. Second, representation. When African-American people see others who look like them in leadership positions or various program roles within the workplace, it can inspire them to aim for similar roles. Representation matters because it helps combat feelings of isolation and imposter syndrome. And it also sends a message that there are opportunities for advancement regardless of race or ethnicity. Enhanced culture is something that's really important as well. When we think about inclusive spaces that promote a sense of belonging and psychological safety among all employees, when African Americans feel valued and respected in the workplace, they are more likely to be engaged, proactive, and committed to the organization's success. Fourth, meeting the customer's needs. A diverse workforce is better equipped to understand and meet the needs of a diverse customer base. By recruiting African American employees in various program roles, companies can better serve African Americans, customers, and communities, leading to increased customer satisfaction and loyalty. And last but not least, social responsibility. In today's society, there's a growing expectation for companies to demonstrate social responsibility and contribute positively to social issues, including diversity and inclusion. By actively recruiting and creating inclusive spaces for African American people in the workplace, companies can show their commitment to equity and fairness. But also, let's keep in mind something that my grandmother used to always say. You can't invite company to a dirty house. So one of the examples that I want to give is that my background, that I've worked in the corporate environment for over 20 plus years, and I most recently joined the federal as a federal employee. But one of the things that organizations I worked for, it was my job to increase the diversity of a certain population. And so what was going on and what was happening is that I said, we just can't really bring these guests into this house not having a clean house. So part of what we also had to do is make sure that the foundation was set. We had to clean the house, make sure that we kind of prepped the house, make sure that we had the house in order, and make sure that everyone kind of quote unquote knew the house rules. And that's something really important as well. As you kind of do the influx of the workforce or the workplace, you also have to make sure that the workforce is ready and the workplace is ready for an influx of a certain environment as well. And so that means prepping anyone that needs to be prepped, as well as asking people to leave if they need to leave, if they're not up to with open arms for these guests as well. So that's something that you really need to keep in mind. And once again, this is just a picture of kind of the 5 things that I mentioned: diversity of perspectives, representation, culture, meeting needs, and social responsibilities. One of the things I showed this picture, and this is my colleague, Dr. Tabitha Temple, who you'll meet a little bit later. And this is a picture of her at her graduation from Howard University when she received her Master's of Social Work. But once again, it was a community that really kind of received her with open arms. Those are not her family members, but her colleagues who truly received her with open arms and accepted her into the organization that they were in. And so this is a perfect example of kind of really accepting those individuals into your organization with open arms and making sure that they are ready for the workforce and making sure that there are resources available to her as she joins the workforce. Next thing I want to talk a little bit about kind of classroom environments. And part of the classroom environments, the question is, cultivating space for the curiosity and development progression of African American children ages birth through 5 through cultural connections. Why is this important? There's a couple of different reasons why this is really important. First, closing the opportunity gap is really important. Building a foundation for lifelong learning, cultural affirmation, and preventing disparities in later years. Let's look at these a little bit closer. When we talk about closing the opportunity gap, we talk about the research has shown that disparities in early childhood experiences contribute to the opportunity gap between African American children and their peers. By providing an enriched and stimulating environment tailored to their needs, we can help level the playing field and ensure that all children have an equal chance to thrive. Next, building a foundation for lifelong learning. Early experiences shape the brain's architect and lay the groundwork for future learning and development. By fostering curiosity and providing opportunities for exploration and discovery in the early years, we can instill a love of learning that will serve African American children throughout their lives. Cultural affirmation. Once again, cultivating spaces that celebrate African American culture, history, and identity can help children develop a positive sense of self and belonging. When children see themselves reflected in their environment and learn about their heritage, they are more likely to feel confident and proud of who they are. Last but not least, preventing disparities in later years. Investing in the early years can help prevent disparities in health, education, social economic status that disproportionately affect African American communities. By addressing root causes and providing early interventions, we can help break the cycle of intergenerational poverty and inequity. In a story that I want to share, I remember these days. I grew up in North Philadelphia, and I went to a school called Central High School in Philadelphia. In 11th grade, I took American history. Needless to say, I failed American history because once again, I was in an environment where the only history that was taught to me was about people who did not look like me. And we all know that sometimes the foundation of this country was laid by people who look like me. And so I always had questions about where were those people in this history that I was being taught in high school. So needless to say, I failed American history in high school and actually went to summer school and went to a local summer school to my neighborhood. And in that school, that professor that summer decided us to teach us about history that with people who looked like us. And that year, that summer, I told my mom, thank you for telling me that I had to go to summer school so I can pass this class, because that's how I really kind of learned the history about the people who look like me, who laid the foundation for this country. So that was really important to me. Also, when we have these classroom environments, and I know it's difficult, that you also really have to customize the classroom environment to the learners and the individuals that you have in the classroom. In my early career, I also served as an assistant head of school, director of admissions and multicultural affairs at an independent school. And one of the things that I applaud this independent school is that they had a farm on campus, and they used the land that they had on campus to really educate and teach their kids, because they knew that each child learned differently. There were some children who really had to touch and feel things and had to be in that environment to really absorb it. So they used the land and the resources around them to really educate those kids. Not all schools can do that. We all know that, but there are some schools out there that have some resources that can do that. Also, you think about the philosophy when you hear parents to say they have to lay the foundation, the groundwork has to be laid. So sometimes you hear parents talk a little bit about kind of, I'm going to send my child maybe to an independent school, in their early years. And then in high school, I'll send them to a public school because the foundation is laid and that they can be successful in high school as well as college. So once again, the formative years are very, very important to individuals, particularly through that early years when we talk about birth and 5 years of age. Laying that foundation is going to be really, really important. One of the things that this is a picture, and this is a picture of me on the far right, and two of my good friends where we graduated from elementary school. And as you can see, myself on the right hand side, I'm the larger of the three kids that's in the picture and stuff. But once again, I think, in that environment, I was in an environment where, 99% of my teachers were teachers who looked like me and who invested in me. My colleague a couple of days ago asked me, what do you remember about your kind of early childhood years? And I told her there were two teachers that really stood out, Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Pigford. And they were also known as the hardest teachers in the school. Mrs. Johnson was my fifth grade teacher, and Mrs. Pigford was my sixth grade teacher. And so having Mrs. Johnson as my fifth grade teacher, she really instilled a lot of things in me and really pushed me and really drove everyone in the classroom. And unfortunately, growing up in North Philadelphia, going to the local public school, the classes were overcrowded and there wasn't a lot of resources. But Mrs. Johnson made do, and she understood that each child learned differently. And so she tried her best to make sure that she had set an environment and set a stage that allowed for individuals to learn differently. And so she really pushed me. But then after leaving fifth grade, Mrs. Johnson told me that I was going to go to Mrs. Pigford's sixth grade class. Everyone in the school feared Mrs. Pigford. But I remember Mrs. Johnson telling me is that she said, I've laid the foundation for you to be successful in Mrs. Pigford's class and stuff. And so there I was, sixth grade in Mrs. Pigford class, and sixth grade was probably the most formative year for me to kind of set the stage for who I am as a man today, because Mrs. Pigford was just that. She set the bar high, and she made sure that all of her kids met that bar by really working with them individually. And yeah, she was a tough teacher. She pushed you to your limit. but she understood your limit and she understood how individuals learn and how we learn differently. And she made sure that she set the environment, set the stage for us to be very successful. And I thank Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Pickford for where I am today with helping to lay that foundation. And hopefully having environments like this can really kind of help other kids out there, particularly when we talk about birth through 5 years of age and definitely beyond that in their formative years as well. Let's talk a little bit about family engagement, which is really important as well. You know, you ask yourself that question of understanding the strengths and of African American families and reflecting those strengths in programming, offering, and building family relationships. Why is that important? A couple of different things that kind of really is going to stand out here. Cultural competence, empowerment, positive identity formation, effective engagement, and resilience promotion are 5 things that really stood out, particularly for me when we talk about family engagement. First and foremost, cultural competence. Recognizing and honoring the strengths of African American families demonstrate cultural competence and respect. It acknowledges the unique values, traditions, and resilience within these families, fostering trust and rapport between service providers and families. And that's really important. Once again, laying that groundwork, foundation, particularly when it comes to trust and rapport. Empowerment. By highlighting the strengths of African American families, programs can empower them to build on their existing resources and capabilities. This strengths-based approach shifts the focus from deficiencies to assets, promoting self-efficiency and resilience within the community. Positive identity formation. When African American families sees their strengths reflected in program offerings, it validates their experiences and promotes positive identity formation. This can enhance family cohesion and pride, contributing to healthier outcomes for children and adults alike. Next, effective engagement. When we talk about effective engagement, we're talking about tailoring program offerings to align to the strengths and preferences of African American families can improve engagement and participation rate. When families feel that their needs and interests are understood and valued, they are more likely to proactively participate and benefit from the services provided. Community building. By building relationships based on mutual respect and understanding, programs can help strengthen social connections within African American communities. This sense of community support and solidarity can provide a buffer against stressors and promote collective well-being for the community. And last but not least, resilience promotion. African American families have a long history of resilience in the face of adversity. Recognizing and building on these strengths can help families navigate challenges and overcome obstacles more effectively, leading to better outcomes for children as well as families. And I think about these 2 pictures, and I want to say happy belated Mother's Day to everyone out there. This is a picture of me and my mother, and I think about her being a single Black mother in North Philadelphia. And I am a product of Head Start in Philadelphia. And our family was also a product of the wraparound services that Head Start was able to provide. And when I think about Head Start, and so for me, it was about 1978 or 1977 when I was in Head Start. So just think about the advancement of Head Start and the wraparound services that they provide today. But back then, my family was able to take advantages of wraparound services such as LAHEAP, which helped with the energy bills back then, not only for my family, but within the community that I lived in, as well as free lunch services that really benefited the neighborhood as well as myself. So once again, you think about the services, particularly the wraparound services that are inclusive of certain environments and certain cultures are really important as you think about kind of, engage in the family engagement. Because once again, the saying that it takes a village, it truly does take a village to raise someone. And for me, it took a village as well as the community in which I was in to help raise me. And so I'm going to stop and end there, and thank you for your time. And hopefully this was some great information for you as you think about the kind of perspective, particularly when we talk about Head Start, particularly a program that is housed and funded here at the Administration for Children and Families. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, dear. We're going to have you stop sharing so I can introduce our next speaker, Natalie Williams. She serves as the Chief Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, or EDIB, Officer at APHSA, which is the American Public Human Services Association. In her current role, she leads APHSA's national efforts to support the development and implementation of a comprehensive and coordinated strategic plan that focuses on advancing EDIB in human services. Her focus is on reimagining systems to be more responsive and inclusive of the community. She has over 20 years of experience in human services with a focus on systems change, community engagement, and data. So I'll turn it over to next Natalie to share with us. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you to my esteemed colleagues on the panel. I've been writing copious notes. So much great information, and I think what I want you all to take away from my presentation is this idea of a practice. So as Natalie Burke said earlier, we are working towards practicing what it looks like to do this work. We don't know everything, and we are experimenting with trying to be very innovative in our approaches to solve for very particular issues. And those issues are gaps that we're seeing in our human services system as it relates to serving all people, with a close look at where we are not having outcomes for particular communities. So I want to share a little bit with you about our vision for where we think human services can go. And this vision was co-created by our members, as well as our staff and our partners at APHSA. So our desired future state for human services, this is probably the main reason why I took this job, because as a human services professional, got so excited about the possibilities of advancing our system to a very different place, both in its service delivery and engagement, but also into outcomes for communities that are served. And so it is led by people with lived experience, meaning that they are centered, their voice is centered in everything that is done, including and up to budgets, including the voice of lived experience and how child welfare runs, how we distribute services, and how people are engaged. Along with that, the foundation and our continued foundation at APHSA is driven by a fierce commitment to equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, noting that racial equity has played a very big role in us advancing equity over the past 10 years, really, and really doubling down over the past 5 to 7 years. Human services that are human-centered and community-driven, embedded with it, don't leave the workforce behind, right? As Dia said, making sure that the workforce is taken care of and aligned with other systems and communities to foster thriving communities. What does this look like? It looks like the idea that belonging is centered in everything that we do. And when I started this journey around belonging, or when we started this journey around belonging, it was really a feeling. Everybody wants to belong. What does that look like? And what we are learning is that it's actually a practice. And that practice is centered in making sure that people are included, that diversity plays a prominent role in helping us understand who we're serving and who we are as a system, that racial equity must be addressed and that it must be considered in everything that we do, That is not to conflate with equity as a part of equity, racial equity, and then equity in general for all people. That we believe in what we've heard is racial healing is a really important part of getting us to that future state. And that community voice, along with framing and narrative, plays another essential role in helping us get there. Inclusion and belonging are intricately connected. They have to fit together. And I know I'm short on time, so I'm just going to speed through this. But I want you all to know how we got to this idea of belonging. Inclusion is a way of engaging and utilizing people across lines of difference. Belonging is the emotional outcome when an individual understands that their authentic self is welcomed and celebrated. It's what we feel when we enter environments that we choose to be in because we feel very accepted, we feel very seen, we feel very heard in those spaces. Belonging is the outcome from our inclusion efforts. So we have to do inclusion well in order to get to belonging. Inclusion and belonging are essential to advancing racial equity. So people will say, well, are you just adding the B at the back end of this? And the answer is no, that inclusion and belonging, they fit together, and they fit together to advance racial equity. But racial equity, we have to address it, as I said earlier, is essential to building systems and communities of belonging. So we can't get to belonging as a society, as communities, without addressing racial equity. A culture of belonging features relationship building, trust, belonging, and authenticity. These are the words that have come out from people in our systems, people that we serve, also our members, of saying, this is what it feels like, this is what it looks like, but they're also words that inspire that future state vision that we talked about earlier. And then at the end, how do we get there? Bridging with constructive dialogue to repair the damages from the impact of structural racism, because structural racism and the impact of that, not being able to get beyond that to build systems of belonging, being able to have a community of belonging so constructive dialogue can occur. We are defining right now, and this is an evolving definition, that belonging is everyone is treated and feels like a full member of the larger community and can thrive. When we talk about the future of lived experience and centering on those people with lived experience, or we talk about the future of human services, centering the voice of people with lived experience, this picture really stood out to me because it allows people who have been involved in systems, who have also supported individuals in systems, who are looking in communities to have individuals who have gained access to systems, that our systems, especially human services, can be reimagined. Our service delivery, our engagement, the way that we are funded, the way that we show impact. And so this young man sitting on top of the world, being able to reimagine what that future looks like through the human services space, is really what is inspiring us to get to this next level of showing outcomes, but not just showing them for the sake of showing them, realizing those outcomes for communities, not only at the national level, but at the zip code level. How are we doing this? So we talk about moving this in action. I'm a big believer in frameworks, for better or for worse, but we really are following this guide, which is grounding ourselves in our EDI data to make sure that we understand what is the picture, who is being served, where, to Natalie's points, are those disparities, where do they exist and why, and how does that relate to inequities in our system. That we are developing targeted solutions, but we're also starting with what's working. So not just going into communities or in our systems and saying, what's bad, we need to scrap, but starting with what's good that we need to advance and enhance in order to get to the next level. That we are focusing on system change opportunities at APHSA. So we know that baseline organizational changes lead to system changes. We really want those big policies, those big system change opportunities that will have long-term impact on a broader scale. We want to focus on those. That we shift power by centering community voice in the work, and in shifting that power, as I learned earlier, realizing what Natalie was really realizing that power that's in the community and making sure that that power is respected and that that power is supported and moving that community voice forward to help us architect what human services looks like in the future. That we listen and act with our communities, not just listen, not just give a $10 gift card, but that we really listen, plan, and act with our communities so that along the way, we're able to pivot if we need to based on feedback, that we build leadership accountability. And that's by setting measurable goals that we are committed to, but that we also check on. Are we moving the needle? Yes. Great, let's keep going. Are we not? Maybe we should reverse and try something else, but that we don't just let things roll until we decide, oh, that didn't work. We need to completely scrap it and try something else. And so that leadership accountability is super important. That we expand and deepen partnerships, both with likely partners that we've had over the years, but also looking at partners that are not up at the table and that we invite those partners to the table. And lastly, that we are always agile and we pivot when necessary, that we don't hold true to one thing at the expense of everything else, that we're able to be agile and pivot as we move forward. And so I am super excited about the work that we are doing here at APHSA. And I just have to say thank you to Dr. Rollins for her partnership in this space, because it has been absolutely amazing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Natalie.
And I'm going to try to stop sharing here. Hold on 1 second.
No problem. I'm going to introduce Dr. Tabitha Temple. She's going to help to bring this all home after you all have heard so much great information about equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging, accessibility, all of the things. What now does this really mean for us? And so Dr. Tabitha Temple is a senior equity advisor with the Administration for Children and Families, where she supports program and regional offices in creating responsive and equitable workplace environments. Before joining the Equity Office, she was a contractor and federal employee for the Office of Head Start, where she worked for almost 10 years across divisions in supporting program monitoring, policy, regional operations, and training and technical assistance divisions. Now, Dr. Temple, you have the floor.
Thank you. And I'm trying to share my camera, but it's not allowing me to. So I will try again. And so while I'm trying to turn my camera on, I will just say that I know that I'm supposed to be a discussant, but I am full. And I just want to, resign from my job, go back into programs and apply everything I just heard. And so I know we don't have a whole lot of time. Dia turned on his camera. Oh, wow. There we go. So I know we don't have a lot of time, but I want to start with Natalie Burke. And there's some structure that she provided to our evolving language. And so, she said it's important. She challenged us to evolve our language, but she also reminded us at the beginning of our conversation that this evolution is not going to be comfortable. I absolutely love that. You said that you're going to feel tense. It's going to be difficult. You're going to be uncomfortable, and that is okay. Don't run away from that. Lean into that. And so I appreciated that, because I know that some leaders, some classroom teachers, they're excited about what they heard from you, but it won't be easy for them. I'm wondering, Natalie, if you could just give us just a tip that we could use, or a strategy that might help us to lean into this discomfort as we're trying to evolve and change.
I think of language, and thank you for the question. I think of language like a muscle. And if you think about, athletes, there is a lot of practice before performance. And so I encourage people to take the time in safe spaces with colleagues and others to explore the language, use it, feel it come out of your mouth and roll off of your tongue. Get put on the spot, be asked the question, and engage in using the language so that you have the opportunity to trip over yourself a little bit. Misstate it the first 3 or 4 times when the stakes are lower. And so the best place to begin to vet new language is in a lower stake situation so that you can refine it, fine tune it. You can actually witness how it impacts people. Is it landing the way that you would hope that it would land? Is it doing what you need for it to do? And then make the adjustments so when it's high stakes, you're ready to go and it flows from you more easily. People often will say to me, how do you talk about some of the most complex things that we have in our society? And it seems like it just flows. And my goal is always to spit it like lyrics. I want to be able to come out of this like Jay-Z. And so when I'm talking about issues of equity, it is really the compilation of hundreds and thousands of hours and conversations that have gotten me to this point. It doesn't happen overnight. So start in a safer space, put in the practice so that when it's time to perform, you can not only perform, but you can outperform your own expectations.
Thank you, Natalie. And the last thing that I will emphasize that you shared with us, I could share a whole lot, but we don't have a whole lot of time, is that it is important to have a shared glossary of language. And while, Natalie, you challenged us to think about the origin of some of the language that we use now, I will say you also emphasized the importance of flexibility. And asking, people we're working with, what is your preference? What feels right? And to not walk in and say Latinx, because you know what? That may not feel right. Or it may feel right to someone. I know that when I did Head Start monitoring work, I would ask families, do you use the term disabilities or children with special needs? What feels right? And I remember one group of families within the tribe said, we call our children exceptional. They're exceptional. And so that's exactly the language that I used during that monitoring visit. So I appreciate the challenge in creating that shared glossary. And we know that glossary may change based on who we're working with. So we'll move. Yes,
the way that we approach it, the one thing that I'll say is we talk about it as a living glossary.
Yes.
Because language evolves so quickly. And particularly if you look in the space around LGBTQIA+, and you begin to recognize the identities that are captured there, they are evolving at light speed. And so often when I'm talking about those particular communities, I find myself asking for grace in advance because inevitably I expect I'm going to mess something up. And that goes a long way. To say, I don't know, and I need for you to tell me goes a long way.
Love it, love it, love it. And also, Natalie, when you were talking, I was thinking about the old adage, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And you clearly reminded us that words have power. Language can make us sick. And so you really centered us around the importance of using language that is healing, that is helpful and not harmful. So thank you so much for those reminders. Dia, I would have to transition to you really quickly, because when you talked about your classroom experience, I tried to hold back the tears because, I'm sure that the participants joining could almost identify and imagine how it felt to be in a classroom and to be surrounded by teachers who really saw you. They saw you, and they set a standard of high expectation for you. So Dia, I'm curious about if there's anyone joining and they are a white-bodied professional and they're working with African-American children, what advice would you give them in helping with positive identity formation in the classroom?
Thank you for that, Tabitha. I would have to say, learn the whole child. And when I say learn the whole child, it's not just who they show up to be in the classroom. They are so much more than that. And I think learning that whole child could really help that teacher really understand that child and have a better classroom environment prepared for that child. And I know in today's society, once again, you have teachers who have 30, 40 kids sometimes in their classroom, and that's sometimes impossible. But nothing's impossible. So try to learn the whole child. And when we talk about the whole child, that child has a family as well. And so those parent teacher days or whatever else, learn the whole child, because unfortunately, we walk and come in that classroom with so much on our back, so much on our shoulders. We're only in that classroom 7, 8 hours a day. And so those other hours, those are other hours that are really shaping that child, and really, those formative years, things outside of the classroom are really shaping them as well. So it's really important to kind of learn that whole child. And I think for me, it was kind of me going from Mrs. Johnson's class to Mrs. Pickford class, and they had a very great relationship. And so I'm sure Mrs. Johnson was in Mrs. Pickford's ear, like, you're going to have this child, you're going to have this child. Let me tell you a little bit about them. And so Mrs. Pickford was able to kind of really prep and prepare her environment for the kids that she was getting that next year as well. And so, learn that whole child is probably the biggest advice that I can really give you.
Thank you so much for those reminders, Dia. And then lastly, we'll move on to Natalie. Natalie, Dia started the conversation talking about Head Start. And we know one of the charge that the Office of Head Start gives programs is to create a welcoming environment. So, I worked for Head Start for many years, and we always thought, oh, that means putting up a picture of a father, having something translated in different languages. Oh, okay, so we're welcoming. But you challenged us to actually lean into an intentional framework, which I absolutely love. And I would encourage anyone listening that works within a program to pull up that framework. And one part of that framework is always being agile and being able to pivot. Can you just talk a little bit more about what that means when it comes to creating environments of belonging?
Yeah, so for me, being agile and pivoting is so important because we don't always have all the information up front. And sometimes we create staffing around projects, we create budgets around projects, and we are focused on driving to outcomes no matter what, whether it's a grant in a nonprofit or if it's outcomes at the state, the local, or the federal level. We feel like that's our accountability mechanism. Being agile and pivoting means that if things aren't working, we can make an adjustment. If we're not getting the outcomes that we want, we say, okay, we need to move to deeper outcomes for this particular focus area. Then we are okay saying, let's stop for a minute and let's maneuver. I also think it gives room for people with lived expertise to be able to provide guidance along the way, because that's not a great practice for us as human services organizations yet. We are really learning how to do that well. And so as we create organizations of belonging, it feels more open to hearing those voices. In reality, we can say, yes, we'll do it. We'll bring them in. We'll sit them at the table. Will you do a zero-based budgeting process with somebody? I mean, that speaks volumes, right? To get to that point. Will they be on your RFPs when you're looking at what new data systems you're going to pay for or develop within your organization? And so as we build these practices, it's getting used to that. It's creating space for other people to join in and give us feedback and maneuver along the way. But it's not easy. I think if we build that margin up front to say, and we will pivot when we need to, it puts everybody on notice, but also gives everybody grace. Things don't always have to be perfect along the way. We can make changes because we're in the people business.
Thank you, Natalie. And you said it, the importance of being agile, because an environment of belonging may feel good for some families, but then your family population may change a little bit, right? And you can't apply those same approaches to different families. Well, they're all African-American families, but we're not a monolith. So what may be comfortable to me may not be comfortable to you. And so it's important to be agile and pivot. So I really appreciate that reminder. Okay, well, Latrice, I have time. I could be here another 5 hours, but I'm sure our panelists and our participants would not appreciate that. And so I'm going to pass the baton over to you, but I so appreciate being a part of this very robust conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for sharing and just really giving us a lot to think about. As Natalie Burke said at the end, just take some time to think about all of this information that's being shared. And so if you all have questions, I know some of the questions have already been answered in the Q&A. Please also take the survey that I put in the chat because we want to know, your thoughts about this particular webinar and also how we can improve as we go forward. But any of my panelists, any closing words, any closing thoughts that you all may have in terms of, what you heard your other colleagues share, or anything you just want to make sure you get out?
I wanted to co-sign something that Natalie talked about, and it's this whole thing around inclusion and belonging. And, so much of my work, our work, has focused on the concept of power. And I think a lot of times when we stop at inclusion, what we don't realize is there is a power dynamic. In order for me to be included, you have to decide that. But when I belong, it just is. And that's really what becomes a more equitable power dynamic, is when we move into that space of belonging. And so I really appreciate, Natalie, the work that you're talking about in terms of moving us towards belonging, because it really is about a more equitable experience of power, more equitable access to it, use of it, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to say thank you for that piece. It's important.
And I'll respond in kind, Natalie, that you and the words that you used today to teach us and to guide us, so important. We forget how to and what we need to say, and to continue to develop our language so that it creates this amazing narrative for people, as opposed to kind of this narrative where everything is terrible and wrong and people are not thriving and everything is against certain groups of people. Although pieces of that are true in some ways, sometimes it's not the whole picture. So I will go back through all of our work and make sure that I'm reframing things based on what you've shared today. I really appreciate that.
Truly, and I just want to close with something something I always hear and take to heart, and Natalie Burke kind of brought this up. Words have meaning and words have power, and kind of keep that in mind.
Awesome. Thank you all again so much for your time, for your expertise, and for our attendees. Thank you for staying on with us. This is important. I didn't want to cut it short. So I wanted to make sure everybody had their full time to share their thoughts, and I think it was well worth it. So everyone, thank you so much. And we will be sharing recording and slides and all those things. And feel free to reach out to us if you have additional questions.